There's something about airports that makes them feel like a stage for real-life dramas. People rushing to catch flights, families saying tearful goodbyes, and business travelers glued to their laptops. It's all part of the chaotic yet fascinating scene. On this particular day, one man stood out in the crowd, though no one around him realized it at first. This guy wasn't flashy or loud. He carried himself with quiet confidence, dressed casually in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie. To most people passing by, he looked like just another passenger waiting to board his flight. But appearances can be deceiving. This man was actually one of the most powerful figures in the tech world, a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from scratch. His company employed thousands of people worldwide, and its innovations touched millions of lives every single day. Despite his success, he preferred flying commercial instead of using his private jet when traveling solo. It wasn't because he couldn't afford luxury. It was more about staying connected to everyday life. Flying coach, or even first class, allowed him to observe how regular folks lived, their struggles, joys, and everything in between. For him, these small moments were grounding, a reminder of where he came from and why he worked so hard. On this trip, he was heading to New York for a crucial meeting with potential investors. These meetings weren't just routine. They could shape the future of his company, taking it global and opening doors to new opportunities. So naturally, he'd booked a first-class ticket weeks in advance. Comfortable seating, priority boarding, and access to lounges. These perks would give him time to prepare mentally for the high-stakes discussions ahead. When he arrived at the gate, there was already a line forming. Passengers stood clutching their boarding passes, chatting idly while waiting for the attendants to start scanning tickets. Our protagonist joined the queue, pulling out his phone to check emails as he waited. Everything seemed normal, until it was his turn to step forward. Yordi. Young airline attendant glanced up briefly, her eyes flicking over his casual attire before landing on his boarding pass. Without missing a beat, she shook her head firmly. "Sorry, sir," she said, her tone clipped. "You're not allowed to board this flight." For a moment, he thought he must have misunderstood. "Excuse me?" he asked politely, leaning closer. "I have a confirmed reservation. Can you double-check?" She gave him a dismissive look, barely glancing at the screen again. "This is a first-class cabin," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the plane behind her. "If you'd like to upgrade, we can assist you with that. Otherwise, you'll need to move to economy." He blinked, caught off guard by her abruptness. Was she serious? He pulled out his digital ticket and showed it to her, pointing out the confirmation number clearly marked under the first-class section. Still, she refused to budge. "I'm telling you, sir," she insisted, now raising her voice slightly. "Your appearance doesn't match the standards expected for this flight." That phrase hit him like a punch to the gut. Appearance? What did that even mean? Was she implying that someone wearing a hoodie didn't belong in first class? Or was it something deeper, something rooted in prejudice? Passengers nearby began to take notice. Some craned their necks to see what the commotion was about, while others exchanged knowing glances. A few murmured quietly among themselves, debating whether they should intervene. Most, however, stayed silent, unwilling to get involved in what seemed like a personal issue. But our protagonist wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when fairness was at stake. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the rising frustration bubbling inside him. "Look," he said evenly, "I've already paid for this ticket. There's no mistake here. If you're unsure, I can call customer service to verify my booking." The attendant rolled her eyes but nodded reluctantly. "Fine," she muttered. "Do whatever you need to do." As he stepped aside to make the call, he couldn't help but notice the whispers growing louder around him. People were speculating about who he was and why he was causing such a fuss. Little did they know, this seemingly ordinary traveler was about to reveal a side of himself that none of them would forget anytime soon. With each passing second, the tension mounted. The attendant fidgeted nervously behind the counter, perhaps sensing that she might have made a grave error. Meanwhile, passengers continued to watch curiously, wondering how this bizarre situation would unfold. No one could have predicted what was coming next. Not even the man himself. What happened after that phone call would send shockwaves through the entire airport, spark outrage across social media, and expose deep-seated biases within the aviation industry. But for now, all anyone knew was that something extraordinary was brewing, and it started with a simple act of standing up for what was right. Standing off to the side, the man scrolled through his phone with a calm but determined expression. He wasn't angry, yet, but frustration simmered beneath the surface. This whole situation felt surreal. How could someone judge him based on what he was wearing? It wasn't just about being denied boarding. It was the blatant assumption that he didn't belong in first class because of how he looked. He dialed customer service, tapping his foot lightly as the phone rang. Around him, passengers continued to glance over curiously, some whispering behind their hands. A few bold ones tried offering unsolicited advice. "Maybe you should just go to economy," one older woman suggested with a shrug, as if solving. The problem was as simple as moving to a different section of the plane. But this wasn't about convenience, it was about principle. If he backed down now, it would only reinforce the idea that people like him didn't deserve respect unless they fit into certain boxes, and he wasn't about to let that slide. Finally, a representative answered the call. "Thank you for calling airline customer support," came the cheerful voice on the other end. "How can I assist you today?" "Hi," the man began, keeping his tone polite but firm. "I'm at the gate for my flight, and there seems to be an issue with my reservation. I purchased a first-class ticket weeks ago, but the attendant here is refusing to let me board." The representative hesitated for a moment before responding. "Let me pull up your information, sir. Can I have your confirmation number?" He recited the digits clearly while glancing toward the gate. The same attendant who had turned him away earlier was now watching him closely, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked annoyed, as though she thought he was wasting everyone's time by making a fuss. After a brief pause, the representative spoke again. "Sir, I see your reservation right here. You're confirmed for first class. Is there still an issue at the gate?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "They're saying I don't belong in first class because of how I'm dressed. I've shown them my ticket multiple times, but they won't listen." There was another long silence on the line. The representative cleared her throat awkwardly. "That shouldn't happen, sir. Let me speak to the supervisor at the gate and sort this out for you." As the call continued, the tension at the gate grew thicker. Passengers were no longer pretending not to pay attention. Some had even pulled out their phones to record the scene, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The attendant, visibly uncomfortable now, shifted from one foot to the other, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When the representative finally returned to the line, her tone was apologetic but cautious. "Sir, I've spoken to the supervisor and they're reviewing the situation. However, they mentioned there may be a policy discrepancy. Could you please provide additional identification or proof of purchase directly to the staff at the gate?" At this point, the man felt torn between disbelief and irritation. Proof of purchase? He'd already shown them everything: the digital ticket, the confirmation email, even his ID. What more did they want? Did they expect him to produce a gold-plated certificate declaring he belonged in first class? Still holding the phone to his ear, he approached the counter again. "Listen," he said firmly, addressing both the attendant and the growing crowd of onlookers. "I've done everything you've asked. I've shown you my ticket, provided all necessary documents, and even spoken to customer service. There's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't be allowed to board." The attendant stared at him blankly, her face pale but defiant. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we can't make exceptions. Our policies are clear. First-class passengers are expected to maintain a certain standard." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late that her words sounded ridiculous. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "What does that even mean?" Another person laughed nervously, shaking their head. For a split second, the man considered walking away. After all, he could easily book another flight or hop onto his private jet. But then he thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of how they looked, dressed, or spoke. If he walked away now, nothing would change. Nothing would. People like the attendant would continue treating others this way without consequence. Taking a deep breath, he decided to escalate the situation further. He ended the call with customer service and opened his contacts list. Scrolling through, he found the number he needed and dialed. As the call connected, he kept his voice low but authoritative. "Hey, it's me. I need you to handle something immediately." Everyone within earshot froze. The attendant's eyes widened in alarm as she realized he wasn't just any ordinary passenger. When he added, "Yes, the CEO of the company," her jaw dropped. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. This casually dressed man standing before her wasn't just someone trying to argue his way onto a flight. He was one of the most powerful figures in the business world. Panic set in almost instantly. The attendant stammered, "Wait, sir, maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Let me check again." But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Within moments, security personnel appeared, followed by higher-level airline staff rushing to contain the situation. Passengers craned their necks to get a better view, snapping photos and recording videos. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you hear? That guy's a billionaire. Who knew first class could turn into such a mess?" Despite the chaos swirling around him, the man remained composed. He didn't gloat or demand immediate apologies. Instead, he stood quietly, observing the frantic scramble of airline employees trying to undo their colossal mistake. It was almost poetic, watching them trip over themselves to fix what they'd so carelessly broken. When the regional manager finally arrived, sweating profusely and apologizing profusely, the man cut straight to the point. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happened here reflects poorly on your entire organization. Your employee discriminated against me based solely on my appearance. That's unacceptable." The manager nodded furiously, promising swift action. But the man wasn't satisfied with empty promises. "You can start by firing everyone involved in this decision," he stated matter-of-factly. "And then issue a public apology acknowledging the bias within your company culture." Though the request seemed extreme, no one dared argue with him. Not when his name carried enough weight to bring down partnerships worth billions. For the airline, this was no longer just a PR nightmare. It was a wake-up call. As the scene unfolded, passengers couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Some cheered silently, glad to see justice served. Others felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. And a handful simply marveled at the sheer audacity of the situation. Who would have thought a hoodie-clad traveler could cause such a stir? By the time the dust settled, one thing was clear. This incident wasn't going to fade quietly into obscurity. It was destined to spark conversations far beyond the confines of the airport terminal. And as the man boarded his flight, finally, seated in first class where he belonged, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The moment the man stepped onto the plane, it felt like a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the chaos at the gate exchanged knowing glances, some nodding approvingly as if to say, "Good for him." Others couldn't help but whisper among themselves, piecing together the details of what had just happened. Word spread quickly. This wasn't just any passenger. This was someone with serious influence, someone whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines alike. Back at the gate, however, things were far from calm. The airline staff scrambled to contain the fallout, their faces flushed with panic. The attendant who had initially denied boarding was visibly shaken, her earlier confidence replaced by sheer dread. Her supervisor, equally flustered, tried to reassure her that everything would be okay, but the look in his eyes betrayed his own fear. They both knew they'd made a grave mistake, one that could cost them their jobs. Within minutes, the incident reached higher levels of management. Calls flew back and forth between the regional office, corporate headquarters, and even executives overseas. Emails pinged across screens as teams scrambled to assess the damage and figure out how to respond. It wasn't just about placating one upset traveler anymore. This was a full-blown crisis. Social media was already buzzing with snippets of the confrontation, and hashtags like Joshgir first-class bias and Joshka airline accountability began trending. Videos recorded by passengers showed the tense exchange at the gate, capturing every dismissive remark and awkward pause. By the time the airline's regional manager arrived, beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He approached the man seated in first class with a forced smile, clutching a notepad like a lifeline. "Sir," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "on behalf of the entire airline, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for what you experienced today. This is absolutely unacceptable, and we're taking immediate steps to rectify the situation." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything right away, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the manager squirm. Finally he spoke, his tone measured but firm. "I appreciate the apology, but words aren't enough. What happened here goes beyond me. It highlights a deeper issue within your organization. Discrimination based on appearance isn't just wrong, it's damaging. And if you don't address it head-on, incidents like this will keep happening." The manager nodded vigorously, scribbling notes furiously. "You're absolutely right, sir. We're committed to making meaningful changes. In fact, we've already begun disciplinary actions against those involved, and we'll be issuing a public statement acknowledging our shortcomings." It sounded good on paper, but the man wasn't convinced yet. "Disciplinary actions?" he repeated, leaning forward slightly. "What exactly does that mean?" "Well," the manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We've placed the attendant and her direct supervisor on administrative leave pending further investigation. Depending on the findings, termination may be considered." "That's a start," the man said coolly. "But it's not nearly enough. This kind of behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's symptomatic of a culture that needs to change. You need to hold everyone accountable, not just the people directly involved." The manager swallowed hard, realizing he was dealing with someone who wouldn't settle for half measures. "Understood, sir. We'll also be reviewing training protocols and implementing mandatory diversity workshops for all employees. Additionally, we'll establish a task force to ensure these issues are addressed systemically." Though the promises sounded impressive, the man knew actions would speak louder than words. Still, he gave a slight nod, signaling that he'd heard enough for now. "Good. I'll be watching closely to see how seriously you take this. If I don't see real progress, trust me, the consequences will be severe." With that, the manager scurried off, leaving the man to settle into his seat. As the plane taxied down the runway, he stared out the window, lost in thought. Part of him felt vindicated, yes, but another part couldn't shake the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He'd faced discrimination before, countless times, but rarely had it been so blatant, so unapologetic. It reminded him of all the barriers he'd overcome to get where he was today, and all the barriers that still existed for others who didn't have the same resources or platform to fight back. Meanwhile, news of the incident exploded online. By the time the plane touched down in New York, videos and articles about the confrontation had gone viral. Journalists dissected every detail, commentators debated the broader implications, and social media users weighed in with their opinions. Some praised the man for standing up to injustice, while others criticized the airline for its apparent bias. A few skeptics questioned whether the whole thing had been staged for publicity, but the overwhelming consensus was clear. Something needed to change. For the airline, the backlash was swift and brutal. Customers flooded their social media pages with complaints demanding answers and accountability. Competitors seized the opportunity to highlight their own commitment to inclusivity, running ads that subtly mocked the embattled carrier. Stock prices dipped, and industry analysts warned of potential long-term damage to the brand's reputation. In response, the airline issued a formal apology later that evening. The statement acknowledged the incident, condemned the discriminatory behavior, and outlined steps the company planned to take to prevent similar occurrences in the future. It was carefully crafted, designed to reassure the public while avoiding legal liabilities. But many weren't satisfied. Critics pointed out that the apology lacked specifics and failed to address the systemic issues at play. As the story dominated headlines, the man found himself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters camped outside his hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse or snag an exclusive interview. Invitations poured in from talk shows, podcasts, and conferences eager to hear his perspective. Instead of basking in the attention, though, he chose to stay low-key. He declined most requests, focusing instead on preparing for his upcoming meeting, a decision that only added to his mystique. Behind closed doors, however, he wasn't idle. The incident had reignited a fire within him, a determination to use his position for more than just personal success. He spent hours brainstorming ideas, jotting down notes, and reaching out to trusted advisors. By the time he walked into the conference room the next morning, he had a plan, a bold initiative aimed at dismantling the very biases that had led to his ordeal at the airport. The meeting itself went smoothly, with investors impressed by his vision and leadership. But as he wrapped up the presentation, he surprised everyone by sharing a brief account of what had happened the day before. "This isn't just a story about me," he concluded, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's a reminder that bias and discrimination are still alive and well in our society. And until we confront them head-on, we can't truly move forward." His words resonated deeply, earning nods of agreement and murmurs of admiration from the room. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a businessman, but as a catalyst for change. By the end of the day, the fallout from the incident continued to ripple outward. The airline announced firings, not just of the attendant and her supervisor, but of several higher-ups responsible for oversight and training. Diversity workshops were scheduled, policies were rewritten, and internal investigations launched. While some dismissed these moves as damage control, others saw them as a step in the right direction. For the man, the events of the past 24 hours served as a powerful reminder of the impact one person could have. Yes, he'd been treated unfairly, but he'd turned that injustice into an opportunity to shine a light on larger issues. And as he boarded his return flight home, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen and ready to change. The days following the airport incident felt like a whirlwind. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across news outlets, social media platforms, and even late-night talk shows. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some praised the man for standing up to discrimination, while others debated whether the airline's response was enough. For him, though, it wasn't about fame or revenge. It was about accountability. He wanted to make sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. Back in his hometown, he found himself reflecting on everything that had unfolded. Despite the chaos, there was a strange sense of clarity. The incident had forced him to confront something he'd always known but rarely dwelled on. No matter how successful you become, biases can still rear their ugly heads. It wasn't just about being wealthy or powerful. It was about being seen as someone who belonged in spaces traditionally reserved for certain types of people. That realization weighed heavily on him. He spent hours scrolling through comments, online, reading stories from strangers who shared similar experiences. One woman wrote about being turned away from a luxury hotel because she didn't look like a guest. A young man described how security guards followed him around a high-end store, assuming he was there to steal. Another person recounted being mistaken for a janitor at an office building where they actually worked as a manager. Each story hit close to home, reminding him of moments in his own life when he'd been judged unfairly. These accounts weren't just anecdotes. They were proof that systemic bias was alive and well. The more he read, the angrier he became. Not at the individuals who perpetuated these acts, but at the systems that allowed them to thrive. It wasn't enough to fire a few employees or issue a public apology. Real change required deeper work. Work that went beyond one company or one industry. Determined to do something meaningful, he called together a small team of trusted advisors. They gathered in his office, surrounded by whiteboards and sticky notes, ready to brainstorm solutions. "I don't want this to end with me," he told them, pacing back and forth. "Yes, I stood my ground, and yes, the airline is making changes, but that's not enough. We need to tackle this problem head-on, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt excluded." His team nodded in agreement, scribbling down ideas as fast as they came. Someone suggested creating a foundation focused on diversity and inclusion in corporate America. Another proposed partnering with airlines and other industries to overhaul training programs. Yet another pitched the idea of hosting workshops and seminars to educate companies about unconscious bias. After hours of discussion, they landed on a plan, a bold initiative they decided to call Equity Forward. The goal was simple yet ambitious: dismantle barriers faced by underrepresented groups in business and beyond. Through scholarships, mentorship programs, and partnerships with major corporations, Equity Forward would aim to level the playing field for future generations. But the man knew that launching such an initiative wouldn't be easy. It required time, resources, and most importantly, buy-in from influential figures across industries. So, he started reaching out to leaders he respected: CEOs, activists, educators, and policymakers. To his surprise, almost everyone he contacted was eager to help. Many admitted they'd witnessed or experienced similar forms of discrimination and were tired of seeing nothing done about it. One conversation stood out in particular. He spoke with a prominent tech executive who confessed, "I've been in rooms where decisions are made based on who looks the part, not who has the best ideas. It's exhausting and it's holding us all back." That sentiment resonated deeply with him. It reinforced his belief that change wasn't just about helping marginalized communities, it was about improving society as a whole. As word spread about Equity Forward, interest grew exponentially. Journalists reached out for interviews, asking how the project came about and what impact he hoped to achieve. In each interview, he emphasized the importance of collective action. "This isn't about one person or one company," he said during a live segment. "It's about recognizing that we're stronger when everyone has a seat at the table. Bias doesn't just hurt individuals, it stifles innovation, creativity, and progress." Public support poured in from unexpected places. Celebrities used their platforms to amplify the message, sharing personal stories of facing discrimination. Politicians cited the initiative as a model for addressing inequality in other sectors. Even competitors in the tech world offered to collaborate, realizing that some battles were bigger than market share. Meanwhile, the airline continued to face scrutiny. While firings and policy changes grabbed headlines, critics argued that true transformation would take years, if it happened at all. Employees within the company expressed mixed feelings. Some applauded the reforms, grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow. Others resented the sudden spotlight, feeling unfairly blamed for issues that ran much deeper. Amidst the noise, the man remained focused on his mission. He didn't want Equity Forward to be seen as a reaction to one incident. He wanted it to stand as a lasting legacy. To ensure its success, he invested millions of dollars into the project, hiring experts in diversity training, education, and community outreach. He also committed to transparency, vowing to share regular updates on the initiative's progress. One of the first steps was launching a scholarship program aimed at students from underrepresented backgrounds. Partnering with universities across the country, Equity Forward provided financial aid, internships, and networking opportunities to aspiring entrepreneurs, engineers, and innovators. Recipients weren't chosen based solely on academic performance. They were selected for their potential, passion, and resilience. The response was overwhelming. Thousands applied, each application telling a unique story of struggle and triumph. Reading through them, the man felt a renewed sense of purpose. These were the dreamers and doers who would shape the future, if given the chance. By investing in them, he believed he was planting seeds of change that would grow far beyond his lifetime. In addition to scholarships, Equity Forward launched mentorship programs connecting young professionals with seasoned leaders in various fields. Participants described the experience as transformative, citing newfound confidence and clarity about their career paths. One mentee, a young woman working in finance, summed it up perfectly. "For the first time, I feel like I belong, like my voice matters." As months passed, the ripple effects of Equity Forward became undeniable. Companies began adopting similar initiatives, inspired by the example set by the man and his team. Conversations around diversity and inclusion shifted from lip service to actionable strategies. Slowly but surely, attitudes started to change. Yet, despite the progress, the man remained grounded. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Bias was deeply ingrained in society, and dismantling it would require patience, persistence, and courage. Still, he felt hopeful. Every story of empowerment, every barrier broken, brought them closer to a world where success was defined not by appearance or background, but by talent and determination. Looking back on the airport incident, he realized it had been both a low point and a turning point. It had exposed the ugliness of prejudice, yes, but it had also ignited a movement. And as he stood before a packed auditorium, delivering a keynote speech about equity forward, he couldn't help but smile. What started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into something far greater, a beacon of hope for generations to come. The months following the airport incident were a blur of activity. Between launching Equity Forward, giving interviews, and overseeing his company's operations, the man barely had time to breathe. Yet, despite the whirlwind, he found himself stealing quiet moments to reflect on everything that had happened. These moments of solitude, whether sitting alone in his office late at night or taking long walks through the park near his home, allowed him to process not just the events themselves, but their deeper meaning. He thought about the day it all began, the dismissive look from the airline attendant, the whispers of passengers, the sting of being judged for something as superficial as clothing. It wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, but this time felt different. Maybe it was because it happened so publicly, with dozens of witnesses watching silently as he stood up for himself. Or maybe it was because for once he had the power to demand accountability, not just for himself but for others who didn't have a voice. As he replayed the scene in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder how many times he'd let similar moments slide in the past. Early in his career, when he was still climbing the ladder, there had been countless instances where he'd been underestimated or overlooked. He remembered walking into meetings and feeling the weight of skeptical stares, as if people doubted he belonged there. He recalled networking events where handshakes lingered awkwardly, followed by polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes. And he thought about the times when colleagues dismissed his ideas only to embrace them later, when someone else presented them. Back then, he'd told himself to rise above it. Prove them wrong, he'd muttered under his breath, channeling his frustration into hard work. And it worked. He built a successful company, earned respect in his industry, and amassed wealth beyond what most people could imagine. But success hadn't shielded him from bias. It had simply changed its form. Instead of outright rejection, he now faced subtler forms of exclusion, like being mistaken for an assistant at conferences or having his accomplishments attributed to luck rather than skill. These memories made him angry, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been treated unfairly. He thought about the young entrepreneurs pitching ideas only to be ignored because of their age or background. He thought about women in boardrooms fighting to be heard over louder male voices. He thought about immigrants working twice as hard to earn half the recognition. Each story reminded him of the invisible barriers that still existed, holding people back not because of their abilities, but because of preconceived notions about who they were supposed to be. But anger wasn't enough. If he wanted to create real change, he needed to channel that emotion into action. That's why Equity Forward mattered so much to him. It wasn't just about addressing one incident. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. He envisioned a world where success was based purely on merit, where opportunities were distributed fairly and where no one had to fight twice as hard to get half as far. To bring that vision to life, he poured his energy into growing Equity Forward. The initiative quickly gained momentum, attracting support from unexpected corners. Teachers reached out to share stories of students inspired by the scholarship program. Parents wrote heartfelt letters thanking him for giving their kids a chance they never thought possible. Even strangers stopped him on the street to express gratitude, telling him that his actions had restored their faith in humanity. Still, he knew the journey wouldn't be easy. Change rarely came without resistance, and there were days when doubt crept in. Critics questioned whether initiatives like Equity Forward went far enough. Some accused him of virtue signaling, while others argued that systemic issues couldn't be solved by one person or organization. He listened to these critiques carefully, knowing they contained kernels of truth. No single effort could fix centuries of inequality, but that didn't mean he should stop trying. On tougher days, he drew strength from the people around him. His team at Equity Forward became more than colleagues. They were partners in a shared mission. Together, they celebrated small victories: a student landing an internship, a mentee securing funding for their startup, a corporation pledging to overhaul its hiring practices. These wins reminded him that progress, no matter how incremental, was worth celebrating. He also leaned on his family during moments of uncertainty. They had always been his anchor, grounding him when life threatened to spin out of control. His mother, in particular, played a crucial role. She often reminded him of where he came from, a modest upbringing marked by struggles and sacrifices. "You've come so far," she'd say, her voice filled with pride. "Don't forget why you started." Her words resonated deeply. Growing up, he'd watched his parents work tirelessly to provide for their family, instilling in him a strong sense of responsibility. Now, as a leader with resources and influence, he felt obligated to pay it forward. Helping others wasn't just a choice, it was a duty. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he sat down with his teenage daughter. She'd been unusually quiet lately, and he sensed she had something on her mind. "What's going on?" he asked gently, setting aside his phone to give her his full attention. She hesitated before speaking. "Dad, do you think things will ever really change? I see what you're doing with Equity Forward, and it's amazing. But sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we try, the same problems keep happening." Her question caught him off guard. He hadn't realized she'd been paying such close attention to his work, or that she carried worries about the future. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Then slowly, he began to speak. "I won't lie to you, it's complicated," he admitted. "There are days when it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. But here's the thing. Every step forward matters. Every person we help, every barrier we break brings us closer to a better world. It might not happen overnight, but I believe it's possible." She nodded thoughtfully, her expression softening. "I guess that makes sense. It's just hard, sometimes." "It is hard," he agreed. "But that's why we have to keep going, because if we don't, who will?" Their conversation stayed with him long after she went to bed. It reminded him of the importance of perseverance, not just for himself, but for the next generation. Kids like his daughter deserved a future free from the biases and barriers that had plagued previous generations. Creating that future required patience, resilience, and unwavering commitment. As weeks turned into months, the impact of Equity Forward continued to grow. Companies across industries began reevaluating their practices, inspired by the example set by the man and his team. Employees started speaking up more openly about discrimination, knowing their voices might actually be heard. Slowly but surely, conversations shifted from denial to acknowledgement, from complacency to action. For the man, these changes validated everything he'd worked for. Yes, there was still a long way to go, but the seeds of transformation had been planted. Watching them take root gave him hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in a fairer, more inclusive world. And yet, he remained humble. Despite the accolades and admiration, he never lost sight of his roots. He knew that true leadership wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about service. By using his platform to uplift others, he hoped to inspire a ripple effect, one that would extend far beyond his lifetime. As he prepared for another busy day ahead, he paused to glance out the window. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the city skyline. It was a new day, full of possibilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them head-on. After all, the journey toward equity wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone willing to take a stand. Months turned into years, and the ripple effects of that fateful day at the airport continued to spread. What started as a single act of defiance had grown into something far greater, a movement that inspired individuals, challenged corporations, and reshaped conversations about fairness and inclusion. The man who had once been dismissed because of his hoodie was now celebrated not just for his success, but for his courage to stand up against injustice. By this point, Equity Forward wasn't just an initiative, it was a household name. Its logo, a simple yet striking emblem symbolizing unity, could be seen everywhere. On billboards, in corporate training materials, and even tattooed on the arms of scholarship recipients who credited the program with changing their lives. The foundation had grown exponentially, partnering with schools, businesses, and governments to tackle bias head-on. It wasn't just about scholarships or mentorships anymore. It was about creating systemic change one step at a time. The airline, where the incident occurred, became a case study in both failure and redemption. After the firings and public apology, they worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. They implemented mandatory diversity training for all employees, revamped customer service protocols, and established advisory boards made up of community leaders to ensure accountability. Slowly, passengers began noticing a shift, not just in how they were treated but in the overall culture of the airline. Employees seemed more empathetic, policies felt less rigid, and flights carried an air of mutual respect. But the transformation didn't stop there. Other industries took note. Hotels revised their check-in procedures to eliminate profiling. Retail stores retrained staff to focus on customer service rather than appearance. Even tech companies notorious for homogeneity started diversifying their leadership teams. These changes weren't perfect, and progress was often slow, but they marked a turning point, a collective acknowledgement that the status quo needed to evolve. For the man behind Equity Forward, the journey had been deeply personal. He'd faced moments of doubt, exhaustion, and frustration, but he never lost sight of the bigger picture. Every scholarship awarded, every mentee empowered, and every policy changed reinforced his belief that individual actions could spark widespread impact. Yet, despite the accolades and admiration, he remained grounded. Success, he often said, wasn't measured by headlines or awards. It was measured by the lives touched along the way. One of his proudest moments came during a special event hosted by Equity Forward. Hundreds of people gathered in a grand auditorium to celebrate the foundation's achievements. Scholars, mentors, and advocates shared their stories, each one more inspiring than the last. A young woman named Maya stood out among them. She had grown up in a low-income neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Despite excelling in school, Maya had assumed college was out of reach until she received a scholarship from Equity Forward. Now, she was graduating at the top of her class with dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. When Maya stepped onto the stage to speak, the room fell silent. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. "Before I found Equity Forward, I didn't think someone like me could succeed," she admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "I thought the world would always see me as less than. But this foundation showed me that my potential isn't defined by my circumstances. It's defined by what I choose to do with them." The audience erupted in applause, and the man sitting in the front row wiped away a tear. Moments like these reminded him why he'd started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about proving a point or seeking revenge. It was about giving others the opportunities they deserved. As Equity Forward expanded globally, its message resonated across borders. In countries where discrimination was ingrained in societal structures, local chapters sprang up, adapting the initiative to fit cultural contexts. Activists translated training materials into multiple languages, while grassroots organizers held workshops in rural communities. The universal appeal of equity transcended language barriers, uniting people under a shared vision of fairness. Back home, the man continued breaking barriers in his own unique way. Whether speaking at conferences, mentoring young professionals, or pushing boundaries within his own company, he remained steadfast in his mission to inspire equality and excellence. He encouraged others to use their platforms for good, reminding them that leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. His influence extended beyond business and activism. Artists drew inspiration from his story, creating music, films, and books that explored themes of resilience and justice. One documentary titled The Ripple Effect chronicled his journey, weaving together interviews, archival footage, and personal reflections. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, praising its ability to capture the complexities of fighting for change in an imperfect world. Despite the fame, he stayed humble. He avoided flashy cars and extravagant parties, preferring instead to spend his free time volunteering or spending quality moments with his family. His children grew up watching him lead by example, learning the value of empathy and integrity. His daughter, now in college, often joked that she wanted to follow in his footsteps, but only if she could find her own path. He smiled whenever she said it, proud that she understood the importance of authenticity. Looking back on everything that had happened, he realized the airport incident had been both a curse and a blessing. It had exposed the ugliness of prejudice, yes, but it had also given him a platform to fight back. Without that moment, Equity Forward might never have existed. And without Equity Forward, countless lives might never have been transformed. He often thought about the airline attendant who had denied him boarding. He wondered what had become of her, whether she'd learned from her mistake or continued down the same path. Part of him hoped she'd found redemption, realizing that everyone deserves a second chance. After all, forgiveness was as much a part of equity as accountability. As he prepared for retirement, he reflected on the legacy he'd leave behind. Money and titles were fleeting, but ideas endured. By planting seeds of change, he hoped to inspire future generations to keep pushing forward, to question norms, challenge biases, and build a world where everyone truly belonged. In his final speech before stepping away from the spotlight, he addressed a packed auditorium filled with scholars, mentors, and supporters. "When I started this journey," he began, his voice steady but emotional, "I didn't know where it would lead. All I knew was that I couldn't stay silent. Today I look around this room and see proof that our efforts are making a difference. You are the dreamers, the doers, the change makers. Together, we're building a future where success isn't determined by how you look or where you come from, but by the strength of your character and the depth of your determination." The crowd erupted in cheers, standing ovation echoing through the hall. As he stepped off the stage, he felt a profound sense of peace. His work wasn't done, nor would it ever be, but he trusted that others would carry the torch. The ripple effect he'd set in motion would continue long after he was gone, shaping a world that was fairer, kinder, and more inclusive. And so, the man who had once been denied boarding because of his hoodie retired not as a victim of bias, but as a beacon of hope. His story served as a reminder that sometimes standing firm in the face of adversity isn't just about winning, it's about paving the way for others to rise alongside you. Because true leadership isn't about leaving a mark, it's about leaving a legacy.